if anybody had gotten a hold of this. It could have taken down the entire Azure ecosystem. We're talking Azureggedon. Now, this is one that I've actually been meaning to dig into. I thought I was going to have some more time to, but Dirk-Jan here, super smart guy who covers just about everything hacking Azure and Entra ID. And he found an exploit that was probably the most impactful since Eternal Blue. And he found it inside Azure. The long and short of it is, with this exploit, you could have taken over any tenant in Azure. Yeah, it's wild. So we call this one token to rule them all, obtaining global admin in every Entra ID tenant via actor tokens. I've been dying to cover this one, so let's get into it. While preparing my Black Hat and DEF CON talks in July this year, I found the most impactful Entra ID vulnerability that I will probably ever find. This vulnerability could allow me to compromise every Entra ID tenant in the world, except possibly those in national cloud deployments. So if you're an Entra ID admin reading this, yes, that means complete access to your tenant. The vulnerability consisted of two components, undocumented impersonation tokens called actor tokens that Microsoft uses in their backend for service-to-service communications. Additionally, there was a critical flaw in a legacy Azure AD Graph API that failed to properly validate the originating tenant, allowing these tokens to be used for cross-tenant access. So effectively, this means that with a token I requested in my lab, I could authenticate as any user, including global admins, in any other tenant. Because of the nature of these actor tokens, they're not subject to the security policies like conditional access, which means there was no setting that could have mitigated this for specific hardened tenants. Since the Azure AD Graph API is an older API for managing the core of Azure AD or Entra services, access to the API could have been used to make any modification in the tenant that global admins could do, including taking over or creating new identities and granting them any permission in the tenant. With these compromised identities, the access could have extended to Microsoft 365 and Azure. That's beefy. Initially, whenever Microsoft triaged this, they triaged it at a 9.0. Eventually, they did go back and revise it to a 10, because if this wasn't a 10, I don't know what would have been. So the impacts, these tokens allowed full access to the Azure AD Graph API in any tenant. So real fast, for anybody who doesn't know, the Azure AD Graph is the primary API that handles most everything you're going to do, or any application that's going to interact with Azure and Entra is going to do it. You can do pretty much damn near anything through the Graph API. And I've done things like go read people's emails through the Graph API, go get all their Teams messages, go list all the files and get the files from their OneDrive. Anything you can pretty much think of, you can probably do it in Graph. Let's see, requesting actor tokens does not generate logs. Even if, that's bad. Even if it did, they would be generated in my tenant instead of in the victim's tenant, which means there's no record of the existence of these tokens. But furthermore, the Azure AD Graph does not have any API level logging. So its successor, which is the Microsoft Graph, does have this logging, but for the Azure AD Graph, this telemetry source is still very limited preview, and I'm not aware of any tenants currently having this available. Since there's no API level logging, it means the following Entra ID could be accessed without any traces. Dude. So the user information, including all the personal details that are stored in Entra, group and role information, tenant settings like conditional access policies, application, service principals, and any application permission assignments, as well as device information and BitLocker keys synced to Entra. By the way, if you didn't know that, yeah, your BitLocker keys sync up to Entra. God, this is so bad. This information could be accessed by impersonating a regular user in the victim tenant. So if you want to know what the full impact is, my tool RoadRecon uses the same API, which is the legacy Graph API instead of the new Microsoft Graph API, because Microsoft sucks at branding. If you run it, then everything you find in the GUI in that tool could have been accessed or modified being the keyword, by an attacker abusing this flaw. So if a global admin was impersonated, it'd be possible to modify any of the above objects and settings. This would result in a full tenant compromise with access to any service that uses Entra ID for authentication, such as SharePoint Online or Exchange Online, or just anything that you've got SSO'd over to your Entra. It would also provide full access to any resources hosted in Azure, since these resources are controlled from the tenant level and global admins can grant themselves rights on the Azure subscription. Modifying objects in the tenant doesn't usually result in audit logs being generated. That means that while theoretically all data in Microsoft 365 could have been compromised, doing anything other than reading the directory information would leave audit logs that could alert defenders. Though without knowledge of the specific artifacts that modification with these actor tokens generates, it would appear as if a legitimate global admin performed the actions. I had never heard of actor tokens prior to this event, so I doubt a lot of admins are looking at whatever specific log telemetry comes with using those actor tokens. Based on Microsoft's internal telemetry, they did not detect any abuse of this vulnerability. So if you want to search for possible abuse artifacts in your environment, a KQL detection is included at the end of the post. That's so nice. I do like Dirk-Jan. I've gotten to meet him a couple of times, and he's a great guy. Super smart. All right, this is the juicy part. So the technical details. Actor tokens are tokens that are issued by an access control service. I don't know the exact origins of the service, but it appears to be a legacy service that is used for authentication with SharePoint applications, and also seems to be used by Microsoft internally. I came across this service while investigating hybrid Exchange setups. The hybrid setups used to provision a certificate credential on the Exchange Online Service Principal in a tenant, with which it can perform authentication. These hybrid attacks were the topic of some talks I did this summer. The hybrid part is not relevant, as in my lab, I could have added credentials to the Exchange Online Service Principal without the complete hybrid setup. Exchange is not the only app which can do this, but since I found this in Exchange, I will keep talking about the tokens in the context of Exchange. Exchange will request actor tokens when it wants communication with other services on behalf of a user. The actor token allows it to act as another user in the tenant when talking to the Azure AD graph. So the actor token, which is just a JWT, I refuse to call it a JWT, by the way. So there are a few fields here that are different from the regular intra ID access tokens. The audience field contains the GUID of the Azure AD Graph API, as well as the URL for Graph Windows Net. And the tenant it was issued is whatever this UID here is. The expiry is exactly 24 hours after the token was issued. The IAS field contains the GUID of the intra ID token service itself, called the Azure ESTS service, and again, the tenant GUID where it was issued. The token contains the claim trusted for delegation. Ooh. Yep, right there. Which is true in this case, meaning we can use this token to impersonate other identities. Many Microsoft apps could request such tokens. Non-Microsoft apps request an actor token would receive a token with this field set to false instead. Oh, interesting. So when using this actor token, Exchange would embed this in an unsigned JWT. What? When using this actor token, Exchange would embed this in an unsigned JWT that is then sent to the resource provider, in this case, the Azure AD Graph. So in the rest of the blog, I will call these impersonation tokens since they are used to impersonate users. So this is what that unsigned JWT looks like, right? Algnun type JWT. This is completely expected, but let's look at what we've got in here. So the SIP, SMTP, and UPN fields are ignored when talking to the graph, which only cares about the name ID. So the name ID originates from an attribute of the user that's called the net ID in the Azure Graph, the Azure AD Graph. So you'll also see it reflected in the token issued to users. The PUID claim, which stands for the passport UID. I believe these identifiers are an artifact from an original code base which Microsoft used for its Microsoft account consumer system. So they're still used in intra ID, for example, to map guest users to the original identity of their home tenant. Gotcha. So mentioned above, these impersonation tokens are not signed. That means once Exchange has an actor token, it can use the actor token to impersonate anyone against the target service it was requested for, up to 24 hours. In my personal opinion, the whole actor token design is something that never should have existed. It lacks almost every security control that you would want. No logs when the actor tokens are issued. Since these services can craft unsigned impersonation tokens without talking to intra ID, there's also no logs that they were created or used. They can't be revoked within 24-hour validity period. They completely bypass any restrictions configured on conditional access, and we have to rely on logging from the resource provider to even know these tokens were used in the tenant. Microsoft uses these tokens to talk to other services in their backend, something that Microsoft calls service-to-service communications. If one of these tokens leaks, it could be used to access all the data in an entire tenant without any useful telemetry. So in July this year, Microsoft did publish a blog about removing these insecure legacy practices from their environment, but they did not provide any transparency about how many services still use these tokens. All right, now we're getting to the actual blood in the water here. So fatal flaw that led to the Cross-tenant Compromise. As I was refining my slide deck and polishing up my proof of concept for the code for requesting and generating these tokens, I tested more variants of the tokens, changing various fields to see if the tokens still worked with modified information. As one of the tests, I changed the tenant ID of the impersonation token to a different tenant in which none of my test accounts existed. The actor token's tenant ID was I'm in your .cloud. Nice. And the unsigned JWT generated had the tenant ID of a different one. Boop. But if it's unsigned, that doesn't matter. The whole purpose, by the way, if you're not familiar with this, an unsigned JWT is bad. It's bad. Because the idea for the JWT is the header should tell you what the type is, a JSON web token, and what the hashing algorithm was used to secure this. And then all this information is then hashed, and then a signature, and then it's basically signed with a key and then appended as the signature. Why is it done that way? Because this token has to go to the user. If the user gets it and then can change any of this crap in here, they could go impersonate anything that the JWT says they've got access to. So maybe there's a field in here that says is admin. You just change that from false to true. Boom, you're instantly an admin. So the signature makes sure that the information stays complete and coherent and wasn't modified. So I sent this token to the graph using my CLI tool RoadTX, expecting a generic access denied since I had a tenant ID mismatch. However, I was instead greeted with a curious error message. Authentication unauthorized. User was not found. So the error message suggested that while my token was valid, the identity could not be found in the tenant. Somehow the API seemed to accept my token even with the mismatching tenant. So I quickly looked up the net ID of a user that did exist in the target tenant, crafted a token in the Azure graph, happily returned the data I requested. Oh. I tested this for a few more test tenants I had access to make sure I was not crazy, but I could indeed access data in other tenants as long as I knew their tenant ID, which is public, and the net ID of a user in that tenant. RIP. So to demonstrate the vulnerability, here I'm a guest user in the target tenant to query the net ID of a global admin. So then I impersonate the global admin using the same actor token and can perform any action in that tenant that has a global admin over the Azure AD graph. Oh, RIP. Let's see. The screenshots are a little bit weird because these weren't for his slides, he said, but we'll look at this. So first thing he does is he crafts the impersonation token for a guest user in the victim tenant. So if you didn't know that, you can have guest accounts in your tenant. And he does that by using the get impersonation token from Road Tools. So I use the token to query the net ID of a global administrator. So he goes through and he's like, okay, who's a GA? Then I create an impersonation token for this global admin, which is the UPN kept the same since it's not validated by the API. And finally, this token is used to access the tenant as the GA, listing the users, something that guest users are not able to do. I can even run Road Recon with this impersonation token, which queries all of the graph API endpoints to enumerate the available information in the tenant. RIP. And none of these actions would actually generate any logs within the victim tenant. Dude. Bro, that is wild. Let's run through this again here. So what he did is, you can have guest users in your tenant. So he goes through and he gets an impersonation token as a guest user in a tenant. Uses that token to query the net ID of a global administrator. So once he's got that net ID, he creates that impersonation token using the global admin's net ID. And then finally, that token is used to basically access the tenant as a global admin. That is not complicated at all. I don't know how they said that was a 9 instead of just a straight up 10 from the get-go. Let's go look at something real quick. If you ever run through this exercise, let me see if this is the right one. I haven't had to actually use a calculator in a bit. So over on the NIST.gov site, they have a basic CVSS calculator. And there's a couple of things for it. The attack vector, the complexity, what privileges you need, does it require any kind of user interaction? Does the scope change or remain the same? And then what's the impact of this? So let's think about how this one should have been. You need network access. Easy to obtain because it's in the cloud. It's in Microsoft's environment. You have network access to it. Attack complexity, pretty dang low. It was 4 steps and it was publicly available information. So privileges required, none. And then user interaction, nope, they didn't have to click a link or enter any text, nothing. Scope absolutely changes because you're going from one tenant to another. And since you're a GA, you've got access to everything. So I don't know how they even had the balls to say that this was a 9 instead of a straight up 10. It must have been that Microsoft math. Man, so bad. All right, let's take a look at the practical abuse here. So with this vulnerability, it would be possible to compromise any intro ID tenant, starting with an actor token from an attacker-controlled tenant. The following steps would lead to a full control over the victim's tenant. So you find the tenant ID of the victim tenant, which is public information. You find a valid net ID of a regular user in the tenant, and there's a lot of methods to do that. Craft an impersonation token with the actor token from that attacker's tenant, and use the tenant ID and the net ID of the user in the victim tenant. Pretty straightforward. Like I said, there's ways to gather these two pieces of information. And then you list all global admins in the tenant, get that net ID, craft a new impersonation token for the global admin, and then perform any read or write action over the Azure AD graph. Now, just to remind you, the Azure AD graph is the legacy version. It's not the actual Microsoft graph, which is like the new approved API that it should be. But Microsoft likes to leave things backwards compatible, so the Azure AD graph is still up there. The hint should be that they don't even use the term Azure AD anymore. Let's see. So if an attacker makes any modifications to the tenant in step 6, boop, that would be the only event in the chain that generates any telemetry in the victim tenant. So an attacker could, for example, create new user accounts, grant them GA privileges, and then sign in interactively into the Entra ID or Microsoft 365 or any third-party app that integrates with the victim tenant. Alternatively, they could add credentials on existing applications, grant these API permissions, and use that to exfiltrate emails or files from Microsoft 365, which is a technique that's pretty popular among threat actors. Pretty much, you add in some backdoor credentials into an app, you impersonate it, and then you get into the system. An attacker could also add credentials to Microsoft Service Principals in the victim tenant, several of which can request actor tokens that allow impersonation against SharePoint or Exchange. For my DEF CON and Black Hat talks, I made a demo video about using these actor tokens to obtain global admin. Video uses actor tokens within a tenant, but the same technique could have been applied to any other tenant by abusing this vulnerability. Nice. So good. All right, so what are the ways you can find the net IDs? Since tenant IDs can be resolved when the domain name of a tenant is known, the only identifier that is not immediately available to the attacker is a valid net ID for a user in that specific tenant. As I mentioned above, these IDs are added to Entra ID access tokens as the PUID. Any token found online in screenshots, examples, or logs, even those that are long expired or have been obfuscated signatures, would provide an attacker with enough information to breach the tenant. Threat actors that still have old tokens for any tenant from previous breaches can immediately access those tenants along with the victim accounts that still exist. Ooh. The above is probably not a very common occurrence. What is more realistic is an attacker simply brute forces a net ID. Unlike object IDs, which are randomly generated, net IDs are actually incremental. So looking at the differences in net IDs between my tenant and those in some other tenants I analyzed, I found the difference between a newly created user in my tenant and the newest user to be within a range of about 100,000 to 100 million. So simply brute forcing the net ID could be accomplished in minutes to hours for any target tenant. I haven't seen a good brute forcing attack in a while. And the more user exists in the tenant, the easier it's going to be to find a match, since this does not generate any logs and it isn't a noisy attack. Because of the possibility to brute force these net IDs, I would say this vulnerability could have been used to take over any tenant without any prerequisites. There is, however, a third technique which could be even more effective and more fun. I do like fun. Compromising tenants by hopping over B2B trust. I previously mentioned that the user's net ID is used to establish links between the user account and multiple tenants. This is something that I researched a few years ago when I gave a talk at Black Hat in 2022 about external identities. The below screenshot is taken from my own slides, which illustrates that we have a tenant A resource tenant and a tenant B home tenant here. So our guest account alternatives, the security ID maps to the net ID. So that net ID is kind of how they're tracking you through the entire Azure ecosystem. So the way it works is as follows. Suppose we have tenant A and B. A user in tenant B is invited to tenant A, and the new guest account that is created in tenant A, their net ID is stored as the alternative security IDs attribute. That means that an attacker wanting to abuse this bug can simply read the attributes from tenant A, put in an impersonation token for tenant B, then impersonate the victim in their home tenant. Oof. It should be noted that this works against the direction of invite. So any user in a tenant where you accept an invite will be able to read your net ID. And with this bug could have been impersonate you and your home tenant. In your home tenant, you have full user account, which can enumerate all the other users. This is not a bug or risk with a normal B2B trust, but it's simply an unintended consequence of the B2B design mechanism. A guest account in someone else's tenant would also be sufficient with the default Entra ID guest settings, because the default settings allow users to query the net ID of a user as long as the UPNs know. Ooh. This is why, so going through this section right here, this is why I was trying to, before tonight, get some more headway on this and make sure I understood all the interactions, because it gets deep quick. It's so many moving parts. I think the only system I've seen that might be more convoluted is Kubernetes. To abuse this, a threat actor could perform the following steps, given that they have access to at least one of the tenants with a guest user. So query that guest user for the alternative security IDs attribute, which basically gives them the net ID. Query the tenant ID of the guest user home tenant based on the domain name in their UPN. Like I said, that's very easily public information to get. Create an impersonation token impersonating the victim in their home tenant. Optionally, you can list the global admins and impersonate those to compromise the entire tenant. Repeat step 1 for each tenant that was compromised. So bad. The steps can be done in 2 API calls per tenant, which do not generate any logs, and most tenants will have guest users from multiple distinct other tenants. This means the number of tenants you compromise with this scale exponentially, and the information needed to compromise the majority of all the tenants worldwide could have been gathered within minutes using a single actor token. It's just the time for worms, man. We had the NPM Shai-Hulud, and this could have actually kind of become almost like an authentication worm, where it could have just taken over everything. Not exactly a worm, but actually, there's ways to go set up runbooks that will run automatically in Azure. So it's not entirely out of the realm of question that if this had gotten out, you could have compromised that tenant, set up an automated task to go through, gather this information, and then look for other tenants to go compromise, and then move on from there. After at least one user is known per victim tenant, the attacker can selectively perform post-compromise actions in these tenants by impersonating GAs. Looking at the list of guest users in the tenants of some of my clients, this technique would be extremely powerful. I also observed that one of my first tenants will likely compromise Microsoft's own tenants, since Microsoft consultants often get invited to customer tenants. Many MSPs and Microsoft partners will have guest accounts in the Microsoft tenant, so from the Microsoft tenant, a compromise of the most major service provider tenants is one step away. Dude. Needless to say, as much as I would like to have tested this technique in practice to see how fast this would spread out, I only tested the individual steps in my own tenants, and I did not access any data I'm not authorized to. We are so lucky that Dirk-Jan found this, because can you imagine if anybody knew about this technique, they were probably keeping it real low and keeping it for extreme use cases, because this is a golden key. Think of it like Eternal Blue. The code for Eternal Blue was very well guarded, basically a state secret, and that's what this technique is being compared to. Think about if anybody had gotten a hold of this. It could have taken down the entire Azure ecosystem. We're talking Azureggedon right here. Okay, so he's got some information here on detection. While querying data over the Azure AD graph does not leave any logs, modifying data usually does generate an audit log. So if modifications are done with actor tokens, these logs look a little bit curious. So we see a type user, display name, object ID, user principal here. Since the actor token involves both the app and the user being impersonated, it seems like Entra ID gets confused about who's actually making the changes, and it will log the UPN of the impersonated GA, but the display name of Exchange. Yeah, that is interesting. See that? Display name up here is Exchange, but the UPN isn't Exchange, it's the GA count. Luckily for defenders, this creates a nice gateway when attacker tokens are used in the tenant. So after some testing and filtering with some fellow researchers that work on the blue side, we came to the following detection query. And so he's got a nice little KQL query here. The exclusion for group operations is there because some of the products do actually use actor tokens to perform operations on your behalf. For example, creating specific groups via the Exchange Online PowerShell module will make Exchange use an actor token on your behalf and create a group and Entra ID. God, there's so much information. This is awesome though. All right, let's wrap it up. This blog discussed a critical token validation failure in the Azure AD Graph API. While the vulnerability itself was a bad oversight in the token handling, the whole concept of actor tokens is a protocol that was designed to behave with all the properties mentioned in the paragraphs above. If it weren't for the complete lack of security measures in these tokens, I don't think such a big impact with such limited telemetry would have been possible. I'm so glad he found this and brought it to attention and got it resolved. Let's look at the timeline here. So he initially reported this on July 14th. MSRC opened the report the exact same day. MSRC requested a halt further testing until they validate the vulnerability. Microsoft published a fix for the issue globally into production. The issue confirmed as resolved by MSRC. And this was pretty fast. Look at this. This was less than a week. And good, because it was a pretty serious issue. He reported it on the 14th. They had pushed this and confirmed resolution on the 23rd. Actually, they pushed the fix 3 days later. They confirmed resolution on the 23rd. A little bit later on the 6th, they pushed out further mitigation to prevent actor tokens from being issued for the Azure AD graph with Surface Principal credentials, which is good. They cut him a CVE, and then he got to release the blog post. Ooh. And this is starting to actually finally pick up some traction in the like cybersecurity news cycle, but it wasn't much when it first hit. I was just out of time and I was trying to get more understanding on this. This is so terribly bad. I have to say again, I'm really glad Dirk-Jan found this out before someone who had really bad motives figured it out. Take over the entire Azure ecosystem. Jeez.